In these next three chapters in Rene Guenon's Reign of Quantity, the chapters are 23, 24, and 25. Time changed into space. 24 is toward dissolution, and 25 is the fissures in the Great Wall. And I think this book does get better as it goes along. I'm having quite a bit of fun with it now. As he gets more into the sort of metaphysics of the process of decay that's taking place right now. Over the course of these chapters, he discusses this idea that there are two phases to the Kali Yuga, to its final, as it's getting to its eschaton, its final point. And the first phase, as he's writing this in 1945, has already been completed, which is solidification. And solidification then turns out to have been the scientific creation of a materialist cube. The world has been transformed into a static, inert, solid, and the New Jerusalem has been realized, which is made up of all of minerals, has been realized as the edifice or shell that has been constructed as a sort of protective exoskeleton that has been constructed by scientific materialism. And he says that's done. So the thing that is going to be solidified has been solidified. Now the next part of the process, he says, should start setting into motion, and this is the process of dissolution. So the cube, the thing, the solid that has been realized, manifested on the corporeal plane, must now be assaulted, disintegrated, and eliminated, and dissolved for the Kali Yuga to reach its final eschaton, its final end point. And toward this effect, he talks about this idea in the chapter on the Great Wall of these fissures that then appear. So he invokes the myth of the Great Wall, and he says that civilizations build walls both physically and symbolically, but I think here he's mainly talking about the sort of symbolic wall built by science as a metaphysical edifice to protect us against incursions from what I would call the astral plane, but what he refers to in here as the inferior subtle realm, inferior beings from the subtle realm. I think it's just easier to call it the astral plane, that can get in through cracks and fissures that start opening up in this edifice, and these entities start getting in there. And this is interesting because I did a series on Beowulf a little while back on another channel. I'll be in the process of uploading those videos to this channel soon. But I realized when I was reading Beowulf, which is a work of consummate craftsmanship, whoever this Anglo-Saxon individual was, this man who wrote Beowulf, it has an almost Joyce-like complexity to it. It's nothing like the Hollywood oversimplification done by Neil Gaiman and Robert Zemeckis. It's not. Beowulf isn't just a dragon slayer myth about a tough guy killing monsters. There's more to it than that. A lot of subtle things are going on in it. And one of them is that it sort of presupposes that you know what the cosmology of the Scandinavian world picture was. And in that world picture, and you can find this, it's explained by Snorri Sturluson in the prose Eddas, but he's simply gotten the information from the poetic Eddas. Those are the two texts that you would read to get this world picture, which says that basically the world is protected by a great wall. So you have to imagine this gigantic wall that rings the world around in the Scandinavian universe. And it's there specifically to keep giants out from the outer darkness, the realm of the outer darkness. It's there for a reason. It's an immunological protection. And in Beowulf, the presupposition is that somehow Grendel is a giant that has come in from the outer dark through a fissure in that wall and gotten inside the palace of Heorot. And so their immune system doesn't function right for some reason. Their warriors aren't able to deal with Grendel effectively, so they have to import a dragon-slaying solar hero named Beowulf from the Danes, or the Geats, I guess his tribe is called. And so they import him, the Danes bring him in, and he does the deed for them. He functions as the immune system to slay the giant, Grendel and his mother. And so they plug him into the myth, the artist plugs him into the myth of Thor, because Thor was the great monster slayer in the mythology of the Scandinavians. Thor was the immune system whose job it was to keep the giants out. And whatever other monsters happened to come in through the world wall, get over it or tunnel through under it, it was always Thor's job to put a stop to this. And indeed, it's interesting because what he's talking about here, he invokes the myth. There's a Chinese myth that he invokes, an ancient Chinese myth about the creator beings Fushi and Nukwa. Nukwa is the goddess, and I believe she has the compass, hence the round architecture of the heavens, and he has the square, hence the right-angled masculine thinking. And together they map out and create the world, the square of the earth and the compass circle of the heavens. But what happens is the god of fire, Zhurong, and the god of water, Gangang, get into a fight. And it rages, this fury of elements, these two gods, near Mount Buzhou. And Mount Buzhou, in this mythology, is what holds the ceiling of the world up. And they accidentally knock it off its axis, and it tilts, and it rips a tear in the world's ceiling that is very vital to repair now, because astral beings can slip in through that fissure and get in and cause all kinds of mischief and chaos. So the goddess Nukwa has to go and repair this, and she repairs it by taking the 4 legs off the cosmic tortoise and setting them to the east, south, the north, and the west in order to act as pillars to reassemble the world's ceiling so that the tear is fixed. It's an interesting myth. What's more interesting about it is, way back when I was studying comic books, when I was writing a sequel to my second book, Celluloid Heroes and Mechanical Dragons, I was studying comic books, and I was reading the comic books, the Marvel comics of the 1930s, in which the Human Torch appears as a lone character in the Submariner. They appear as separate characters. The Fantastic Four comes later. It has nothing to do with this initial iteration. The Fantastic Four is invented by Stan Lee, I think in 1961, 62, 63, something like that, as the last dying gasp to try and save Marvel Comics. And he opened up a portal through which all the superheroes then came pouring through that we have today in our films. But back in the 1930s, so this guy, whoever he was, is drawing this comic book of the Human Torch versus the Submariner, the god of water, the Submariner, and the god of fire, the Human Torch. And they go battle against each other, and they knock the Empire State Building over. And I knew about the Chinese myth, and I thought, well, that's really interesting. Does this guy who did this, did he know about Chinese mythology? And I'm willing to bet that he didn't, but that it's simply that, as Joseph Campbell used to always tell his interviewers, myths are alive. They've got their own kind of crackling morphogenetic energy. They know what they're doing, and you're just sort of along for the ride, listening. Shruti is the Sanskrit word to listen to what they have to say. So you're listening, and you're just along for the ride. Now, I also noticed the same myth appearing in the first Avengers movie. The Avengers movie that came out a while back, what was it, 2010, something like that? And in that first one, the plot precisely concerns the god Loki, who uses a cube. It's wonderful how this stuff works. I mean, it's just, he uses a cube called a tesseract, to open up a portal above Manhattan, and he rips a hole through the sky so that all these demons and gods start pouring through. And so the first iteration there of the Avengers is the 7 Avengers, and they have to fight to get these demons out of Manhattan. So there again is Rene Guenon's fissure has opened up there. And these gods are, it's American polytheism, basically, which is basically a ripping and a syncretism of taking gods from the old world and synthesizing them together with Native American gods. For instance, we have Thor, who is just imported whole, along with Loki, his antagonist, one of the antagonists. Loki was the great antagonist in Scandinavian myth. So they bring in, so you've got Thor, you've got Captain America, who is, of course, Achilles with the shield, blonde Achilles with the shield. The Hulk is the ancient medieval green man. Iron Man is, of course, the medieval knight in shining armor who's come to save everyone. Nick Fury with the patch over one eye is Wotan, the god who's the head of the whole pantheon, and Black Widow is simply the ancient spider goddess, who's a big character in Native American myths. Spider-Woman is a bigger character than Spider-Man is in, but they're both in Native American myths. So we get this syncretistic synthesis in the creation of American popular polytheism as the activation of a kind of American immune system to go and fight against these astral beings that are now pouring in through this fissure. And I think the interesting thing about this is that Guenon asks, he says, what is it that, if fissures start appearing then in the Great Wall that science has erected, and it's going to be assaulted by inferior beings from the astral plane, who are going to get into it. But because they built a wall that's complete with the top that's covered, the whole thing is covered, we've cut off communication with the gods, the beneficent beings who would bring us the beneficence of a metaphysical immune system to fight against these astral beings. So he asks, what is it then? And I presume in subsequent chapters he'll tell us what it is that we can use to, or that's, I guess this is the end of the scientific cube, is what he's saying is going to be dissolved eventually and inevitably anyway. But this raises the question, though. Once a civilization has erected a great wall, and most of them do end, as China did, but with the creation of a physical great wall as well as a metaphysical great wall. And the Romans had this too. So the Romans, they had physical great walls, the limes, going across right along the Rhine. The Rhine was really they were taught a lesson at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest by Arminius, the German who massacred the Roman regiments under whom Augustus was emperor, and he had nightmares about it. It was a terrible thing. So the Romans were terrified of crossing the Rhine. After that point, they just didn't do it. So that was the boundary. So what is it then that allowed the Germans finally to come pouring across into that boundary, get into Rome, and start installing German barbarians on the throne? And I submit that what happened was, this takes place in 410 AD. Rewind back 2 decades to 390 AD, and we have Theodosius the Great, who is the first emperor to outlaw paganism. So Theodosius, Constantine had converted to Christianity, and he said basically, okay, we can allow Christianity now. We'll tolerate Christianity and paganism, they'll coexist side by side. Theodosius says no, and he shuts down paganism. He closes the Temple of the Vestal Virgins. He makes the Olympic Games obsolete. They're no longer allowed to be practiced. Shuts down the libraries at Alexandria. All the pagan festivals, rites, and festivities of Dionysus, gone. Even writing in Egyptian hieroglyphics, gone. Now, once you do something like that, of that kind of deconstructive magnitude, you are disintegrating the metaphysical immune system of a civilization. Barbarians are going to get it. It's just like when you get sick. You don't get sick because you get a virus. You get sick because your immune system got weak. We're exposed to viruses and bacteria all the time. We only catch the illness once there's a weakening for some reason. You might be depressed over the end of a relationship or something. Whatever it is that causes you to fall ill. Same thing with civilizations here. They have metaphysical immune systems made up out of ideas, and that are concretized on the physical plane through rites, the practice of ritual, symbol, myth. All that stuff is necessary to keep a civilization healthy and to keep it from becoming prey to another society, which if it's weakened, the other society will come in. And it's the law of nature. It'll just come in and swallow it up whole. So that leads then to the question now of the fact that in today's scenario, we don't have a metaphysical immune system. It's weakening because the left has essentially deconstructed it. The left has dismantled all the great narratives, all the meta-narratives, and basically done the same thing, more or less, almost, that Theodosius did to paganism, thereby rendering inadvertently, he didn't think this would happen, rendering the civilization prey to the external proletariat of the German barbarians who came in and dismantled it. We got to be careful here. We cannot just let the left disintegrate everything and have ourselves become prey then to another society, because that's exactly what will happen, I guarantee it. So there has to be ideas that are vital and alive and crackling on the metaphysical plane, but on the level of popular culture now, we can see that in naive narratives like the Avengers movie that I mentioned, that even at the popular level, the popular folk mind is aware of what's going on, that there are fissures being torn now into the metaphysical great wall of our civilization through which astral beings, maybe real ones, who knows, are coming in. See, the problem with what science has done in creating this through what Guenon calls the solidification process of the creation of this metaphysical exoskeleton is it's created a worldview which has anathematized the supernatural world. For the first time in history, we find ourselves in a civilization where most people simply don't believe that there's another world, that this is all that there is. That's never happened in history before, I can guarantee you that. That's new, and it's bad news. The astral plane is real. Trust me, it's a real thing. And it will get in, if a metaphysical immune system is not built up. And if it isn't built up, you can see it crumbling through the rise of mental illness, especially with illnesses that have to do with the disintegration of psychological micro-walls, such as schizophrenia, for instance, paranoia. Those kinds of mental illnesses are the kinds of illnesses that become rife and rampant in a society, spree killers also, in a society where the metaphysical immune system has been dismantled, deconstructed, neutralized by whatever means has gone on. So we're in a crisis mode here. And I think that Guenon, I think he's actually correct here. We went through a process of solidification through the creation of a materialist external shell that is now under assault. By one means or another, it will be dissolved and liquefied, because that's simply the way history works. He's right about this. Every one of these civilizations, if we look at Toynbee's model, Toynbee was a pragmatist. He didn't have Spenglerian determinism. So he wants to come up, he knows Spengler was basically right. He just didn't like the Germanic, Scandinavian determinism with the invocation of the norns and the fates. And so he didn't like that. So he brought in British empiricism. But nonetheless, he ends up with phases that sound an awful lot like Spengler's model. Every civilization has a genesis. So there's a reason that it comes into being. It has a growth period. Then it has a breakdown period. Then it has a disintegration period. Then it has a period where a universal state is created, and at the same time the creation of a universal church. That's 6 phases. Phase number 7 is called the heroic age. That corresponds to Guénon's dissolution. That's when the barbarians come in and inaugurate a heroic age through the creation of epos. The only creative act they do is creating the epos, the Scandinavian myths, let's say, or the Homeric myths, whatever those barbarians are bringing with them. It will be orally recited. They're usually not literate, and passed down through the generations. So you get a heroic age. And that age, for Toynbee, he characterized it as the sweeping and clearing of the stage of world history of what has been created, so that the new civilization can then come along with a new Genesis phase, and we get something new coming out of all of this. So, though Toynbee was not a determinist, turns out that his model is applicable to almost every society that he analyzes anyhow. They've all gone through the same process. So it basically amounts to a kind of determinism, since he demonstrates that all these phases apply to all the civilizations anyhow, even if it's not predetermined. It turned out that way. So pretty well, it might as well just be a predetermined model, that when a civilization comes into being, it has a morphology. It has an internal structure, just as Cuvier said that he could reconstruct an entire animal from a bone. He could just find a bone, and because he knew what the geometry was, the tilt, the axis, where the spine must go, whether it had hooves or horns or not, he could reconstruct the whole organism based on known morphological laws for how animals construct themselves. Spengler then borrowed this from him and says, I can do the same thing with civilization. If you give me a part of a civilization, I can reconstruct the whole thing for you based on this morphology, and it will be a deterministic model. And I can tell you what phase or stage those ruins of that civilization were at when they were active, and now they've become these fossils and shells. So I think this is very interesting, this whole discussion that Guénon brings in about the Great Wall now having fissures that are opening up, and it's in trouble. So I'll be interested to see how this progresses, how he works this out.